now I get a chance to introduce our breakfast speakers, Vu and Pia. And they certainly don't need a long introduction by any means, and I know you've all seen their bios and been following their work. I thought this morning I'd rather focus on the history of their friendship. A long time. And when I was talking to Pia this morning, I don't know if you know this fact, but she is one of the main reasons that Vu changed the name of his blog from Nonprofit with Balls to what it is today. So I think that's something to celebrate. They met at a conference for API leaders, and a friendship really sprouted from there. And a couple of other kind of fun facts. Vu has been in a mariachi band, and I'm not going to say the name of the band, Vu. Pia, in high school, toured a musical band in Europe. Pia, in high school, toured a musical band in Europe, and her solo was Memories from Cats. So, so as you could see from the work that they do in the community to even their musical talents, they are a match made in heaven this morning. So.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We had so much in this sort of 30 minutes, and then we have 20 minutes of Q&A. So just quick disclaimer, we're not going to be able to get through everything, but we have a session afterwards, and we look forward to covering more of those details there. I also want to acknowledge that I realize I'm a cisgender man on stage at this. I feel very honored, and I don't take it for granted. So thank you very much for having me in this space. Pia, you have an opening.
I'm not a cisgendered man. I'm really honored to be here, actually. That my opening thought actually is listening to be here, actually. That my opening thought actually is listening to Paula and the introduction of who you are as a network. Is that I think that our title is mistitled. I don't think you have to leave the Titanic because you don't operate as, mainly it doesn't sound like you operate as traditional foundations, some of which have sort of very problematic inceptions, and sort of one hand is doing one thing and the other hand is doing another. Because you're sounds like more like an individual donor network and a giving center network, I don't know that you have a sinking ship to leave, unless we're talking about other metaphors. But I do think that I'm excited because I get excited every time I get a chance to speak to people who I feel like can have the agency to imagine a better way of doing what has been called traditional philanthropy since the early 1900s. And when we titled this session, I was thinking a lot about how the Rockefellers and the Fords that were created in the early 1900s were created at a particular time in history. And I think we're at a particular time in history that needs new forms. So I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you this morning. And it was worth leaving my 15-month-old daughter. Last night to wake up in a different city for a day. So thanks.
Pia, I wanted to start by talking about trust-based philanthropy because you've been involved with this. In fact, that's actually one of the reasons we met. Right? I remember when I was at RBC to you and I said, hey, I have this great organization and I'm thinking that might be a good fit for the Women Institute. Can we talk? And then you said, yeah, let's talk in 3 weeks. And then 3 weeks later we talked and you had read everything about RBC's work. You read our 36-page evaluation report. And I was shocked and kind of scared. And that was kind of my first taste of trust-based philanthropy because suddenly it shifted the burden from me trying to prove something to you actually being a partner and doing the homework. So can you talk a little bit about that movement and how it has been going, how funders have been responding to it?
Sure. I mean, I won't say the whole story of the trust-based philanthropy movement, but it came because our grantee partners found out that our foundation was spending out our endowment. So, first point. I mean, there's no legislation or policy. There's just habits. There's habits of sitting on endowments. There's habits and patterns of accumulating wealth and thinking that giving a tiny percentage of that wealth kind of ameliorates the problematicness of how that wealth may have been accumulated. So because we do with ourselves. And they said, spend the next 10 years trying to get folks to give the way you give, which is what the principles are based on. So it's long-term unrestricted funding. You know, Vu and I like to throw around 10 years as something to try on. What about 10-year grants? I mean, what are the pros and cons of that? We can talk about it, right? But so they're long, meaning you figure out what it is that you want to support, and then you actually go out and discover who is doing that work on the ground and who are the non-traditional, underfunded, very, very difficult to fund. I mean, it may not seem like Vu, who is a nationally recognized brand, comedian and future Netflix series producer. It may be hard to imagine Vu in that role of nonprofit executive director, and I think that that role, if any, who's ever been one in this room? Right, so you know like what a slog it is. It's very difficult to get recognized. Like what a slog it is. It's very difficult to get recognized and seen. It's very difficult to get in front of funders. It's very difficult to have your application be read. And so the idea is if we're proactive and thoughtful about what we're trying to fund, that we find leaders like Vu who are slugging it out in Rainier Valley, but maybe they don't PR arm, but they are doing it. Like they're supporting incredible leaders in Rainier Valley to not quit their jobs today. You know, that's what Vu was doing for years and had to kind of apply that medicine to himself, and that's where I think a lot of the humor comes from. It's because what else can you do but laugh when you have foundations like asking you to write basically the same thing but in their format in 20 different ways, right? And then nobody reads it, and then they ask you, the first question is, so what do you do? What are you trying, well, really, what kind of impact do you want to have? Which again, Vu just spent like 10 hours writing 36 pages. So, which again, Vu just spent like 10 hours writing 36 pages. So the approach of trust-based philanthropy, which you can learn more about if you go to trustbasedphilanthropy.org, is really how to be, how to demonstrate these principles of equity that Vashtai and others have been talking to you, them and embody them in your role as donors. That's basically it. So there's more to say about that, but I'd say that when I met Vu, I think that you might even be, I don't even think you approached me with, hey, Rainier Valley. I think we met, we talked about your work as colleagues, and then I think I surprised you and said, okay, what do you need me to jump through? What do you want? And I said, send me something you've already written for someone else, and don't worry about taking like the logos off or anything. Because I know you don't have time to like wipe Ford out and put the Whitman Institute there. It doesn't really matter. So the Whitman Institute there, it doesn't really matter. So just this stance, right? What I'm trying to describe here is a stance that is about acknowledging just the power conferred by having wealth, resources, money or dollars to be either the stewards of or the gatekeepers of. You know, I think as women in this particular society and time, we might sort of think of ourselves as not being agents and not having power, right? And there's a lot of examples of why. But I think that any time, even someone like myself who doesn't have inherited wealth, that I am in a position to make, I don't know that I necessarily deserve. So the way that I want to hold it is with a level of humility, with a learning stance, and with curiosity, and then thinking about who in this region or this issue area or this country has an impossible time getting foundation funding, and that's who you and that's who we want to start with, right? Start there. Do your due diligence there after you've asked yourself what area you want to work in and why and what you're accountable to. Start looking for the Vuli before he was famous, and support them. And support them, because now people are just throwing money at Vu.
I would actually thank you, Pia. And I know that you're joking about this, but the reality is people have not been throwing money.
Yeah.
And you know, and this is actually efficient because it is based on trust. We've been treating nonprofits the way that society treats poor people, which is like, we want to help you, but we don't actually trust you. We give you some money, but you can't spend it on diapers. You know, and when you reach a certain point, then we're just going to cut off, so you're always on the perpetual edge of poverty forever. That's how we treat poor people. And that is also how foundations have break out of that starvation cycle that has been referenced. But I think the really important point is that it does not affect everyone equally. It disproportionately affects marginalized communities. So even though I have been in this national spotlight for the last couple of years, we still have very little national foundation that has given, and no one has given over $50,000 to Rainier Valley Corps. That's a national organization, that's a national foundation. And it gets very frustrating because national foundation will go to me and say, Vu, I love your blog, we use it all the time for our trainings. And I said, well, can you give me my organization some money? And I said, well, can you give me my organization some money so that I can keep doing stuff, so I can write about that, so that you can keep learning from it? And they go, sorry, you're too local, and also you don't have a track record of being on a national impact, so we can't fund you. And I think this is if I cannot fund you. And I think this is if I cannot get funding from foundations on a national level, then how can any leaders of color get it? And I think this is why one of the things you and I talked about, Pia, is that leaders of color have been burning out and have been leaving the sector because of these practices that we have here. This is why we're falling off and into the water without lifeboats are going to be people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ communities, people in rural areas, people who are serving older adults. So what you said about finding and targeting the communities that really need the help, I think this is what we need to really start thinking about. It cannot be a level playing field. We have to get out of this sort of belief that there's a level playing field, that we need to level it. The field will never, ever be level, ever.
And if you even think about the metaphor we're using with Titanic, there was actually a subfloor of the Titanic that we're not even, there was actually a subfloor of the Titanic that we're not even allowed to go see the sunshine on the deck, right? So clearly they drowned first because they weren't like allowed out from underneath, you know. So I mean, I only joke around Vu lightly because we're friends, but I remember many conversations we had are willing to let go of kind of the habits of traditional philanthropy, right? Is you can have a relationship where leaders will tell you when they're ready to quit. And they'll tell you without fear that you're gonna stop funding them, right? So they will say, so I've had many nonprofit EDs call me and say, I love you, they're so distinct, no one does what you do, right? And the only reason we didn't fund VU forever was the limitations of our own portfolio size, right? We give multi-year, we pledge most of our funds to multi-year projects. So we have an annual fund. So just to say, like, if we're writing down, we have an annual fund. So just to say, like, if we're writing down kind of structure pieces, 70% of our portfolio is dedicated to multi-year long-term grants, 3 to 10 years, right? And then we have 30% of our grant-making portfolio annually is an annual fund to be responsive, because you are good once in a while that you didn't meet 10 years ago and you want to have something for them. But one of the things that nonprofit leaders can do when there is a sort of base of both funding and support, and they have this felt experience that you're not extract good, you're not making them run through hamster wheels, but when there's that level of trust, they can call you and say, I really want to quit today. It's really hard today. And that's the kind of vulnerability. And then you can also call them and say, I talked to another room full of people who told me that trust-based philanthropy is ridiculous because it's not strategic, as if you can't have relationships of trust and be intelligent and strategic at the same time. And I sometimes think that that condescension is because I'm young and I'm Filipina and I'm queer. I'm probably only Filipina trustee of an endowed foundation that I know of. If you know of any others of me, please direct them. But the point is, I think you could have different kinds of relationships, and then there can be something more transformative for both parties. If you're not spending your time pretending, like Vu and I often, there's like the pretending, right? But let me ask you something, Vu, because I think that your perspective, and you're really humble about this, your perspective about what we really need to do as a sector to be all those words, impactful, effective, around inequities, socially, politically, economically. Like, can you say a few words about this conversation we've been having about the fearfulness sometimes of wading into what could be described as political, like that's a political grant, that would be political giving.
I'm actually working on a blog post. Political, come on, let's get political. And I really do think we have to embrace this now. We have been terrified. And the reality is that progressive foundations fund way more inefficiently and ineffectively than conservative foundations and funders. Inefficiently and ineffectively than conservative foundations and funders. And I'm not the only one who's been saying this. This has been studied by Sally Covington, and the research that she's been doing. And it's been like this for 2 decades. I don't think we're here to talk about politics in a partisan way. But if we're going to be realistic and we're going to be effective in our work, then we have to start addressing the fact that we are afraid of advocacy and lobbying and being engaged in mobilizing community power. And so what happens is that we're just constantly intellectualizing about stuff. And we just like address and help someone who's experiencing homelessness. And we don't maybe change things like increase taxes and change housing legislation so that there may not be people experiencing homelessness in the first place. And we're just afraid of it. And I really think I'm tired of it. Afraid of it. And I really think I'm tired of it. Communities are really, really tired and frustrated. I know lots of funders like Pia that are frustrated too. And there was one event where I was just like sitting down, people were like, let's spend the next 5 years defining equity. And I just kind of lost it because, I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old and I have lost all sense of patience. And I was like, we don't have time to define equity anymore. Like if you're still defining equity, you need to get along. You need the definition of equity is about moving power and resources to the communities that are most affected by the ongoing legacy of slavery and colonization and patriarchy. Mm-hmm. That is the only definition that we need now. Mm-hmm. And people are like, well, what do we need to do? Well, there are things that we can do. And the thing we need to do is basically do what conservative foundations have been doing very effectively. But we just need to do it counter. So right now, for example, I would say we need to elect more women of color into office. We have to change our tax codes to office. We have to change our tax codes. We have to get corporations' influence out of politics. We have to ensure that communities that are most marginalized are voting, that are support to vote. And we have to start changing public perceptions to be allied with science and facts and not fear, which has been allied with science and facts and not fear, which has been very pervasive nowadays. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Pia? Let's get political.
Let's get political. Okay, sorry. I love having this discussion with you, Vu, because I think you're known so much for your humor, but I know you also as like serious and passionate about you have no patience for the bullshit, and I really appreciate it. I think some of those concrete suggestions, again, that we get, so we can really look at things like what does it mean to fund for political power for underrepresented communities, right? It means that we can actually fund to get folks elected. We can fund towards policy and fiscal policy change. We don't need to be afraid of those. The conservative movement that Covington, David Callahan, and others have studied, it's actually been about 4 decades, Vu, where and not all conservatives, it's actually the extreme, far fringe right has figured out how to fund ideas and people for multiple generations. And that was God agreeing. That is why we are living, that is why we are living in the context and the time in history that we're in. I mean, when I said earlier that the time that Rockefeller was created was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the accumulation, and wealthy people thought, okay, we should probably try to help society. We should probably support democracy, right? We should probably alleviate poverty. Why should poverty exist in the wealthiest country on the planet, right? And yet poverty is actually worse incrementally after you look at the philanthropic movements of the past century. So the reason being, I think that the funding of ultra-right, really anti-democracy, right? Ideas and people have put us in a place where democracy, I think, is under great threat and siege. I think is under great threat and siege. And I think that we have an administration, and I'm not being partisan about this, we have an administration that is hostile to ideas of representative democracy. So it's a scary ass time, right? And Vu and I are both parents, so we get the kind of times that we're forecasting for our 15-month-old and our 6-year-old. So the idea being, like, we have a moment now where we actually still, and we always have agency, but we have an agency that we can give to ourselves around not being afraid to fund for power. We talk about, and I'm sorry that I missed the speakers yesterday, but I'm sure there was some really smart, powerful discussion about inequality. And I feel like on the one hand, we're always talking about inequality and how we need to, do something about it. And on the other hand, we want to give in a way that feels both about it. And on the other hand, we want to give in a way that feels both nonpartisan and not political. Those two things can't coexist. You cannot value and want society to change economically and socially without dealing with the political realities, right? So it's just the truth. And I think philanthropy lives in this weird, siloized, and isolated way in which we might decide we're going to fund in a particular city or we're going to fund in a particular issue, but we're not going to fund culture change or political power. So anyways, we want to get to some concrete and applicable and relevant ideas about ways to think about funding. How much time do we have left, timekeepers?
Got 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So Vu, do you want to speak to? Vu, do you want to speak to? I think you talked about a more relevant philanthropy for our time, especially addressing giving circles and donors. What could, and I'm sure some of you are already doing some of these things, or maybe all of you are doing these things. So hopefully we're not just being really repetitive. But I think all of you are doing these things. So hopefully we're not just being really repetitive. But I think it would be helpful to talk about what we see as very relevant models, relevant practices for the time that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there are power dynamics, right, with many foundations, which is oftentimes the people. There are power dynamics, right, with many foundations, which is oftentimes the people who are in this room are like, yes, I'm all ready for this. And then you have to go back and figure out how to talk to your trustees or your board members or other people.
Family.
Yeah, family members or whoever. But I do think that we have way more power than you think to change things. And we have to kind of start imagining a different sort of philanthropy. And there are certain things that we just do not have time for anymore. Not only because they are annoying, but they are actually harming people. The idea of restricted funding, for example, that is archaic. And it's like, if you are not putting leeches on you for the common cold, you cannot restrict funding. So because it's just like, we are putting out the fires of injustice, and every 3 or 4 steps, you come to us and say, I want to make sure that the money I'm giving you to put out the fire is being spent on the water and not the hose. We do not have time for this anymore. And you are disproportionately affecting people of color, people with disabilities who don't have time to play arcane voodoo magic on Excel to move things around so their overhead rates are lower. We don't have time for this. No more restricted funding. The 1-year grants, that's also, I know that many of you are raising money year to year. But if we are going to be committed, then nonprofits need to have the stability to be able to plan for the future.
If we cannot plan for the future, we cannot be effective. Whereas conservative movements are thinking 20 or 30 years at a time. Bench. It's like a 30-year strategy. And over here, we are planning 1 year, scrambling to Frankenstein bits of funding together, year after year. And then you wonder why we burn out. Yes. We cannot do that anymore.
Thank you, Vu. Thank you, Vu.
Multi-year general operating dollars. My God.
My God. My God is actually the name of our Netflix series. So, a couple of other thoughts. I talked about proactive funding. I think that I can tell a really short story. So the Whitman Institute, we met David Inocencio, who is a social worker, native of San Francisco, who was really, really concerned about the rates of juvenile detention. The neighborhood where these youths lived and the incarceration, it was like a revolving door. Like every time they came out, they went back in. He had this idea about going into the juvenile hall in San Francisco and doing kind of both like creative writing and political voice teaching and workshopping. He couldn't get a single dollar to do it, so he was doing it all on a volunteer basis. So, but his main idea was that it was completely unnecessary to incarcerate these children in the first place. And then it was, what was happening is upon their first incarceration, they were sort of being taught how to stay in the system. And upon their first incarceration, they were sort of being taught how to stay in the system. And that was really troubling to him because that meant they were going to become adults that were going to then be incarcerated and just go back and forth between home and jail and home and jail. And so he wanted to stop and break that cycle, and he knew that there was a big fish to take on for a social worker with no training. We met him maybe 15 years ago. I really believed in him. We didn't tell him we didn't ask about his fire to hose to water ratio, and we didn't ask him to justify any costs. We just said, like, let's fund you and see what you do. It's called The Beat Within, a weekly publication of incarcerated voices in this country. It's in like 7 states. It's an incredible, duplicable, scalable model. We didn't use any of those words, and we still never do because David would like crawl under a chair if we used any terms like that. But when studied, the rates of recidivism in the programs that the Beat Within operates have decreased by like more than 50%. Because what happens is if you give sort of political power, voice, and creative expression to folks who are living in like a, a 4x4 block, all of a sudden their sense of like agency, power, and worth increases somehow. And so, and that's been 15 years of funding. But we didn't say at the beginning, David, could I see your proof of concept? How do you know? At the beginning, David, could I see your proof of concept? How do you know that what you're going to do is going to decrease recidivism rates, right? We didn't ask that. We didn't know to ask that because we just believed in him, and then we've cultivated a long-term relationship to help him build an infrastructure for this model, to help him fund the full cost. And I know that, as donor circles, as giving circles, you're probably pretty lean and you might be all volunteer run. If that's working, great, but it does take people power to do this kind of giving, right? If you're gonna do something other than sit behind a laptop, right, and review stuff, then you're gonna have to have people, women like Vashtai and amazing, incredible women in this room, of the world. Because not all of them are gonna, David he still cannot write a grant proposal. He literally cannot. And I don't care, you know what I mean? He was trained as a social worker. He's now like this incredible, he's become one of the most valued members of social justice society, but he couldn't write a grant proposal if you were gonna give him $1 million, because he shouldn't have to. So the questions I have for you to think about are, what are the habits of grant making that you've picked up from the Titanic of this sector? Is it time to let them go? You could Mary Kono those things. You could tidy up, your bad habits of philanthropy. If it doesn't bring you joy, don't do it. I'm serious. Marie Kondo is the singular reason I don't own a pair of shorts anymore. Just makes me want to suck my stomach in, so they're gone. So you can do that with Philanthropy. Do I really need them to specifically write a report for a one-year grant? This grant is $10,000. Should anyone have to write anything down on paper for this? You know, can we just have a conversation and then, like, say we're going to have? Can we just have a conversation and then, like, say we're going to have a conversation a little bit down the road and ask, what did you learn? You know, so people might be asking, what about impact, Pia? I want to have impact. Understandably, you want to have impact, but the ways that you measure impact, the ways that you try to attribute impact to dollars is it's kind of like its own kind of sketchy math. So what you could say is, Vu, what do you want to learn this year, right? And then 6 months later, you say, what happened? So maybe that could be your closing comment for our talk, Vu, is, you know, trust-based philanthropy often gets this challenge of, well, it doesn't sound like what are the impacts of more effective grant making that we're talking about right now?
I think that the evaluation, why do I sound way louder than you? Is that,
Because you're a guy.
I'm a guy, I'm so sorry. I do think that we have been so hyper-focused on this idea of data and evaluation and impacts, that we had an evaluation and impacts, that we have lost sight of why we're doing this stuff in the first place, right? And we need to get back to why and to the intrinsic worth of individuals and to the intrinsic value of doing this work. I get really frustrated. There was an ED who called me and she said, "Boo, I'm tired of it." There was an ED who called me and she said, "Boo, I'm tired of this. I'm ready to just quit the sector." I said, "What's going on?" She said, "Well, a program officer came to my senior hot meal program and asked how many seniors we served." And I said, "Well, we serve 900 seniors with hot meals every week." And the program officer said, "Well, okay, that's really 900 seniors with hot meals every week." And the program officer said, "Well, okay, that's really great, but like, so what's your outcome?" And my friend was like, "Well, 900 seniors come in hungry and they leave full." That should be the best outcome. We don't need, but no, of course, she was just like, "Oh, well, by serving seniors, they're less likely to have accidents and fall and go to the emergency room. Plus, crime rates have been reduced because bands of roving hungry seniors have been robbing banks and whatever." It's like, no, get over this. Sometimes I say things like, solve almost every single issue that we have is we have more women of color elected into office. Every single issue that you're working on will be solved if we just have progressive women of color in every single office. And when I say things like this, people immediately go, "Okay, but what's the outcome of that? But how are you going to measure the outcome of that? But how are you going to measure this?" Can you imagine conservatives thinking, "Okay, well, how are we going to measure? How do we know we elect conservatives into the Supreme Court that it's going to help us?" They don't spend time on that BS. We do, all the time, and we think, and we're very proud of ourselves when we read a white paper, when we read a logic model, and look at all these arrows. That's amazing. You know, that's so great. Look at this logic. It's flowy. I'm going to put a sticky dot on this, and it's going to be great. This is bullshit. We don't have time for this anymore. People draw a new fish in the sector. And this was referencing a study that was done where they had two groups of kids. They had one group draw a fish. They said, "Please, draw a fish." And then there's another group, and they said, "Draw a fish, but here's an example of a fish." And the kids went and they drew all sorts of creative fish. The kids who were just shown that example of a fish drawing just one time, they drew fish that looked almost exactly like the drawing. You all have had a philanthropy fish in your mind for a long time now. And your goal is to undraw this fish. And it's going to be very difficult because your goal is to undraw this fish. And it's going to be very difficult because it's embedded unconsciously in your mind. But everything that you think about, do we need to have an application? Why? No one requires you to have an application. And yet you have it anyways. And conservative foundations are like, "Oh, this is great. You know, go and do this thing." But over here, it's like if Martin Luther King were here and he's like, "I have a dream, y'all." You know, the response from Philanthropy is, well, we really love your dream, but is it scalable? Is it sustainable? What's the logic model? What's the outcomes? We'll fund you 5% of what you asked for this 1 year, and then maybe progress will fund you 10% of what you asked for next year. And then we wonder why we have been behind on everything. We don't have time for this anymore. People are dying. I think we have some questions from the audience.
While we're taking questions from the,
Some questions from the audience.
while we're taking questions from the audience, I know you're right. I just want to make one point about the flowy logic models. I think that where that comes from, I think the impulse from where that comes from is actually possibly a good impulse, which is, am I responsible, thoughtful, or even bold, amazing, kick-ass steward of this money? You know, I think sometimes that's where the desire to have a logic model-y, proof of concept-y thing comes from. It comes from an impulse to want to do well, and where you're coming from, looking at implicit bias and looking through the lens of equity. How would you, what form could serve that function, but actually be more useful to the people that you're trying to serve and be accountable to? I also want to say people that you're trying to serve and be accountable to. I also want to say, if you're thinking about hiring, don't download a program officer description off the interwebs and then hire for that. Just don't do it. Think about what you're trying to accomplish, right? Think about purpose, you know? Think about the communities you're trying to accomplish, right? Think about purpose, you know? Think about the communities you're accountable to. And then think about the roles of staffing in your context that actually make sense. Like, why can't there be a, are we making sure we're learning officer, you know? Are we sure we're learning officer, you know? Are we finding the woman and the queer folks and the folks in our community who are the most endangered, you know, physically, economically, and politically, and to support them? That's not really an officer, like that doesn't like boil down into like a single person role. But when we think about hiring to build the infrastructure of these like small, agile, and I think it's great to be small and agile. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we think about building so that we have more capacity, right? We don't have to download Atlantic Philanthropy's 17 different kinds of program officer descriptions. Okay, questions?
Yeah. So this question is about endowments and how much money is parked in endowments, and how much money is parked in endowments, and what we need to do to change that, because this 5% threshold payout rate, it's unjust. It's like a house is burning, and you have all this water put out the fire, and you're like, I'm just gonna spend out this fire. 5% will never put out this fire. And you're like, well, I'm saving up the 95% for future fires. The future fires are caused by the current fires that we don't put out. And yet there we are, this 5%. That should be the minimum. It should not be the maximum that you put out every year. A future to save in the first place. So I think this is something that is really critical, and it does involve us all getting into policy and changing tax form. Whenever there was a movement to change the payout rate to 6% or something, and foundations opposed it with every fiber. Every single time this has been brought up, philanthropists have opposed it. And we just can't keep going. 95%, not only is it not being used, it's actually being invested in things that cause the problems that the 5% is used to address.
I have 3 questions here about applications. So is there a role for a common application that's brief and online? What's the alternative to an application that makes the grant opportunity available widely? And can you describe a due diligence process in a trust-based? These are all great questions. I'll just say there have been efforts to create a common application for decades. the resistance comes from all the individual foundations who want all their individual things. Seriously. There have been some regional common application modules, but for the most part, what happens is each foundation wants everything articulated for them specifically, so that those efforts have failed. I think that the question about what due diligence looks like when you're doing proactive grant making is a really good one. You know, so when we we wanted to fund civic engagement, and we wanted to fund civic engagement, particularly in the South. And so once we did that, so then you could, you know, often at that point, most donors and funders say, okay, let's just put out an RFP, and you know, I think that we were too small of an outfit to consider and take in the number of applications we would have gotten, and we would have had to reject like 99% of them. So is an open application process equitable if you're going to reject 99%? And that 99% got their hopes up. You know, they stayed up all night, they filled out your application, they, you know, made everything in the font you wanted and the size of the font you wanted. If we're going to reject 99% of those, and we know we are, then we have a question of whether or not that's true equity. Because I think there's a default of thinking open application processes. You know who wins in equity? Because I think there's a default of thinking open application processes. You know who wins in those processes? People who have really good writers on staff. Not David Innocencio. You know, and Vu just happens to be a great writer. But even he does not always win open application processes in the open market. So, you know, so once you identify really specifically like who and what you're trying to fund and why, then I think that you can use referral networks that are very diverse. And we have a very diverse board. Our trustees are, you know, probably one of the most diverse boards of trustees I've ever sort of seen or sat with. And so we have diverse referral sources both at the board level and then the nonprofit partner level. We go to our friend, like the people we know and have connections with in that region, and we ask, who is doing the amazing, amazing work, but not getting funded? Ideas are not being funded around civic engagement in the South. So in that way, many roads would lead us back to a couple of different organizations. And then from there, we would do a lot of proactive due diligence without bothering them. You know, we would look up all their 990s online. We would look up things annual reports that they put out. I mean, there's a lot of information about many organizations if you just look for it. And so at that point, we realized, oh, we really do want to fund them. We want to meet with them. So we meet with them. And then there's another set of criteria that I didn't talk about, in which we fund collaborative leadership that is sort of partner-oriented and learning-oriented. And I think this sector also really rewards charisma. And so we also look for leaders that are really operating with like a team of staff versus always being singular and to serve. And this is way more information than them filling out an application. You know, going to a community event or a program, you know, that somebody's putting on, and that means, yes, you're flying yourself there, right? It's inconveniencing us. That's really the biggest difference between come, be supplicants to us, and apply using our process. So that's a brief description of what trust-based grant making could look like. In the Whitman Institute's context, we do have many other funders in our network who do grant making differently, and I'm happy to connect you to some of those. Some of them do have kind of a modified application process. You know, and this question about does that mean the grant opportunity is widely available? I think that we're very honest about the limitations of our portfolio size and our reach. So we don't try to say that we're making the biggest difference in civic engagement nationally, because we don't think we can attribute our level of dollars to that. But we do say, I think we're funding some of the people that aren't getting funded, that are doing really powerful long-term community and voter engagement work in the South. Women Engaged, for instance, is a group out of Georgia. They use both like data to figure out how to get more young people of color to vote in Georgia. So that's, and we found them because, again, just really good referral networks. So anyways, that's one take on trust-based grant making in our context, and there are others that you could find out through the project if you want. Do you have other? Find out through the project if you want. Do you have other?
I would say, I think we have to get out of this whole, like this, we need to be widely open to everyone idea. Because that's an idea based on equality, which is that if we got 5 minutes, Bo? Okay. That if we just have this, we got 5 minutes, Bo? Okay. That if we just have this, if we just be fair, then everyone can we would be open and they can all have the opportunity to apply. And I think we have to get out of that. It's like equity is about targeting communities that are most affected by systemic injustice. And if your community has affected by systemic injustice, and if your community has, missing and murdered indigenous women, then you need to target your grants on that. If your community is disproportionately failing Black folks, then you need to target funding going to the Black community-led organizations. So this idea that we just need to just open this wide and then we'll be fair to everyone, it's in a way kind of lazy. It's like you're expecting other people to come. It's kind of like a food bank saying, you know what, we want this food to be available to everyone who's hungry. So we're just going to ask everyone to write an essay about a scorecard about how hungry people are, and then whoever writes the best essay about their hunger will give food to. That would be a lazy way for the food bank to go about distributing food, wouldn't it be? The food bank's job is to find the people who have most food insecurity and provide them with the food. Food insecurity and provide them with the food. That's what we have to think of philanthropy is. It's your job to find the communities that are most affected by injustice and removing all the barriers so that the money is going to those communities. And if people get mad, then, screw them.
Thanks, Vu. So I have a couple more really good questions here. Current IRS regulations, don't they stipulate the 501c3s cannot be political? And how can we build power to change politics, be scrutinized? I mean, I think 501c3, well, obviously you can fund C4s, right, which actually are, set out to do political work, like getting folks elected. And actually, again, it could be a habit where you think, I can only fund 501c3s. Why? You're a giving circle. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? You can actually figure out how to set yourselves up to be able to give to 501c3s. If that's the orientation you have, like you want to build power, you want to get more women of color or people like Vu elected into office, you can give at a 501c4 level. There are also lots of activities that 501c you can give at a 501c4 level. There are also lots of activities that 501c3s do that build power that you don't have to be a C4 to do. So I would say there's a lawyer that we know named Jean Tom in San Francisco, and she and I are going to go on the road together because she mainly imaginal, meaning there are some rules, right? But there's not as many as you think about kind of the policing of that kind of money, especially at the scale that we're probably giving at giving circles. So this is something that, if you want to follow up with me and Jean about, I'm happy to talk about. How do we reassure? There's one question about reassuring people that I want Vu to answer, but there's like one or two things that we can do when we get home to overcome resistance. What are a couple things we can do as soon as we get back to our desks or get back to our giving circles, and there might be folks in the giving circle giving circles, and there might be folks in the giving circle who aren't here yet. They're not kind of aligned with the messages that have been coming from this plenary stage. I don't think it's ever too soon to be doing political development. You're the one who puts programming and curriculum in front of your donors. Experiences are you inviting them into? What kind of resources are you pointing at about how to hold this donor seat? Like we're sitting on donor seats that are on fire, and we're acting like we have time to deliberate. I just think there's a way in which if somebody says, well, I don't know, it's justice. It's like, well, would you like to breathe air or live in a democracy? I mean, between climate change and the populous state in multiple places on the planet, folks, these are real questions. Would you like to breathe air or live in a planet, folks? These are real questions. Would you like to breathe air or live in a democracy or even in a socialist society? If it's yes to any of those things, we might want to really think about these concepts of what we can do right now. And then I think overcoming resistance, I used to run a business. I was a organizational development consultant and executive leadership coach. And my favorite coach used to say to me, almost everyone needs a coach who can give them like a stroke. You are doing so good, Pia. Oh, a stroke. You are doing so good, Pia. Oh my goodness, right? How are you even at work and dressed when you have a baby? You need that, right? And then you also every once in a while need a smack on the cheek. Like, it's stroke and smack. So it's like, yeah, Pia, you should take a shower every day. We need both, right? So I'd say, as the leaders of your giving circles, of your donor networks, of a foundation or whatever, if you're in this room, you're leading a body of people, even if it's your family. And so sometimes they need a giving, and sometimes they need a smack. Wake up, your chair is on fire. Let's do something different. Vu, why don't you wrap it up with your set of questions?
Yeah, there's some really good questions, everyone, and apologies that we won't be able to get through all of them. But we do have a session that's later on at 11 today. That we can do all of them. But we do have a session that's later on at 11 today.
He's afraid no one's going to come to our session. That's why he keeps saying
right?
that. He's like, we have a session later that we don't want to be alone in a room for.
Well, I just want to let people know that we have time later on to answer these questions in case we don't get to them. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. How important is it for us to get larger foundations? If you're a smaller organization, yes. You actually, as a smaller organization or foundation, you can be so helpful. I remember some of the $5,000 unrestricted grants that I've got that were lifesavers, especially during payroll times. So don't underestimate just how and relationship, then they can be 5,000, 1,000 can be so helpful. Don't underestimate that. About coaching, how is it important to help with professional development coaching? Very important, especially right now when EDs, especially EDs of color, are burning out left and right, and that is a serious problem that we are not even talking about at all. It's a serious problem that we are not even talking about at all in this sector. So give money for sabbaticals and coaching and mentorship, professional development. Send people to Hawaii. I'm kind of serious about this. Right, people are afraid of where the money goes, so they don't donate because they're like, oh, I don't want the money to go to overhead, whatever. That's all BS. You need to stop perpetuating it. Just tell them it's BS, and this is why, and explain it to them. But the more that you become apologetic and deferential, the more perpetuates this bullshit that is the overhead myth. So stop it. Right. How do you have, so you have to initiate many of these conversations, and you have to kind of drag it out of nonprofits. Because you're like, so how are we doing? They're like, I don't know. Yeah, you're doing great. You're great. You're like, okay, but you have to ask several times before people will actually be honest with you. And if you actually give general operating funds, they're much more likely to be honest with you. I'm really serious. And the last question is, what is the name of my mariachi band? It was called Los Panchos Vietnamitas. And I thought I was going to be Latino for a while. Yeah. But I know Bo is trying to kick us off the stage. But going with what Pia said about the stroke and the slap, I know I do more slapping than stroking probably. So I do want to end on a stroke, which is you all are amazing. I know this work. The last 3 days you've been learning some very difficult concepts like racism, all this stuff. And I yell at people a lot, and I will continue to do so. But I also am very appreciative of all that you do and all that you're trying to do. And let's work together as partners to move this forward.